Hello, my name is Saleem and I'm going to talk about the Victoria and Albert Museum's pavilion planned for the Venice Architecture Biennale 2021 that I'm co-curating with Ella Kilgallon and Christopher Turner. In the pavilion we are using two very different methods of reproduction, the digital and the physical, to articulate an otherwise underrepresented aspect of Britain's religious heritage. The copy has a renowned history at the V&A. In 1867, the founding director of the museum, Sir Henry Cole, drafted a convention for promoting reproductions of works of art. The knowledge of such monuments, he wrote, is necessary to the progress of art, and the reproductions of them would be of a high value to all museums for public instruction. For the 2021 Venice Biennale, the V&A returns to the idea of the copy, but this time to narrate a specific architectural and social story, that of the mosque in Britain, or to be more precise, of a particular phase of the history of the mosque in Britain. The systems that produce heritage value in the built environment have long been critiqued as privileging specific cultural narratives and ascribing them significance while omitting others. Laura Jane Smith, for example, writes of an authorised heritage discourse, which she describes as a set of hegemonic practices whereby institutions and actors conserve and pass on to future generations certain narratives about the past, and in doing so, promote a certain set of Western elite cultural values as being universally applicable, and which undermine alternative and subaltern ideas about heritage. Heritage in these terms is constituted, justified and privileged, primarily by monumentality, grand scale artifacts, and site significance tied to time depth. In these terms, to qualify as heritage, one needs objects or buildings of a certain longevity, rarity and craft, and one's history needs to have been recorded, researched and articulated. Stuart Hall highlighted the selective nature of the heritage discourse when he asked whose heritage is being valued and signified. He describes the condition of subaltern communities who, he argues, have been omitted from the established heritage discourse. These people, he writes, have no proper archive, no regular exhibitions, no critical apparatus, no definitive histories, no reference books, no comparative materials, no developing scholarship, no passing on of a tradition of work to younger practitioners and curators, no recognition of the achievement amongst the relevant communities. They are, Hall concludes, heritageless. And these are the people who are underrepresented, if not obscured entirely, from the culture and traditions of what we have come to accept as the heritage of the nation. The mosque in Britain is one such underrepresented and undervalued building type. Before the publication of the British Mosque by Historic England in 2018, there was no understanding of any narrative history of the mosque, despite it having a 120-year history and some 1,800 examples across the country. Whilst in the first half of the 20th century there were a handful of mosques in Britain, their numbers spiralled post-war following the end of Britain's rule over and partition of India, and subsequent large-scale migration from the region. Most of these mosques are highly localised and grassroots community endeavours, established by newly arrived migrant Muslims who self-organised, funded and created them. These communities were generally organised along ethno-cultural lines, those who had migrated from the same village, region and country forming social and religious bonds and networks, and establishing these in British towns and cities. The vast majority of these post-war mosques were made through the adaptation of existing buildings. By 2012 it was estimated that some 16% of mosques in the country were purpose-built. The rest were adaptations. The adaptation was the most cost-effective and quickest way of creating new mosques. As mosques have little theological requirement, most buildings could be easily converted. Essentially they need to provide a prayer hall as large as possible, preferably one for men and one for women for congregational prayer facing Mecca, along with ablution facilities. Where houses were converted to mosques, living rooms on the ground floor and bedrooms on an upper floor would be interlinked by removing separating walls to create the prayer halls. Domestic bathrooms would be adapted to create ablution facilities, and often gardens were built over, sometimes in rudimentary ways to extend prayer space further. Many other building types also became mosques. Churches, cinemas, pubs, industrial units. In each of these cases, a series of adaptations are made to overlay this new religious function onto an existing architectural form. Churches convert well because the church hall can simply be retained as a prayer hall, with some additional features inserted which are specific to Muslim traditions. The adaptations of buildings to create mosques was usually a gradual process, carried out iteratively by the resident Muslim community as funding allowed, and to meet the needs of the community's evolution. Buildings were altered, enlarged and resignified with traditional Islamic architectural motifs, replicated in sometimes quite rudimentary ways, over decades. As the second half of the 20th century progressed, the Muslim population in Britain grew. The early South Asian migrants were joined by migrants from Africa, the Middle East, the Balkans, and a host of other places. By the end of the century, Britain had become the most diverse Muslim population in the world, with practically every denomination represented. Mosques continued to proliferate, and from the 1970s, purpose-built mosques started emerging, becoming more prevalent across the country in the 1980s and 90s. These early built mosques were designed by their users. They combined references from historic Islamic architecture with local elements. So domes, arches and minarets were assembled with pitched tiled roofs, domestic brickwork and gables. This ad hoc assemblage of architectural references was common practice in new built and adapted mosques. It was how these newly emerging Muslim communities explored and articulated their identities, both to themselves and to the outside world that they were now living alongside. The post-war adapted mosque, therefore, is a very specific moment in the history of British Islam. It is the first phase of Muslim religious infrastructure in this country. It has been established mostly by first-generation migrants from South Asia, whose migration is a consequence of the decolonial process. With these buildings, the process of change constitutes the heritage of the site, as much as, if not more than, its built fabric. The very process of piecemeal and ad hoc alteration is as characteristic of these post-war mosques as is their architectural form. When the built fabric is so fragile and temporary, how is the mosque's heritage to be recognised and documented? If we understand that the heritage of these mosques is in the very processes and myriad community decisions that have gone into making them, then it is here that their communal and religious significance lies. And it is the relationship of this process to built form that is of specific interest and value. Conventional or authorised ideas of heritage, as critiqued by Smith, Hall and others, privilege the artefact and have limited, if any, mechanism of recognising the intangible. Therefore, the authorised heritage discourse fails to recognise the significance of this phase of the mosque in Britain, and indeed the significance of many sites of migrant space-making. This is because there is no mechanism to capture or recognise the iterative adaptation of these buildings through time, which is their unique characteristic. And it is the very process of architectural change which embodies the social and religious history of the Muslim communities over this period. The V&A Pavilion for the Biennale 2021, therefore, is an endeavour to illustrate this period of the history of the mosque in Britain. The exhibition takes for its subject 3 post-war mosques across London: Brick Lane Mosque, Old Kent Road Mosque and Harrow Mosque. Brick Lane Mosque was established by Bangladeshi migrants in 1976 in a building built in 1743 as a French Huguenot church. It was then reused as a Methodist chapel, a Jewish synagogue and then a mosque. It is a lifespan which reflects the intense migration history of London's East End in which it is situated, and shows how these diverse religious uses have found expression within an historic architectural fabric. Old Kent Road Mosque in South London was established by a Nigerian community and was formed through the adaptation of a former Victorian public house. Internally, the pub was transformed into a space of Muslim prayer, and the existing decor was appropriated into a new Islamic aesthetic. Through the layering of Islamic visual symbols into the space, a new Muslim identity was established, a hybrid of the Victoriana of a London pub, combined with Islamic motifs. Harrow Central Mosque in a North London suburb is now a major purpose-built architectural landmark and one of the biggest mosques in the country. It started life in the 1980s through the adaptation of a pair of semi-detached 1930s houses. The house mosque was modified and enlarged throughout its life, until it could no longer accommodate the size of the Muslim community, and the adjacent site was purchased for the new mosque, with the house then reverting back to its residential use. For the Biennale exhibition, key parts of each mosque are replicated as one-to-one copies, and arranged in the gallery along a stud-frame timber wall that runs throughout the space. The wall serves to physically and visually tie together the fragments of the mosques, suggesting that there is a narrative thread interlinking them, and that they do belong to a historic and conceptual group. The one-to-one fragments are of significant parts of the mosques that have been inserted or grafted into their existing buildings to create this new hybrid Islamic architecture. For each mosque, the mihrab and mimbar are replicated. This is the framed prayer niche from which the imam leads the prayer and gives the sermon. While the mihrab of Brick Lane Mosque has recently been refurbished and is clean cut and polished marble, that of Harrow Mosque was built in timber by a local builder who designed it himself with materials that were readily to hand. Similarly, with Old Kent Road, the mihrab is handmade and painted, and this is recreated along with large parts of the wall of the prayer hall. These show how the pub interior has been lavishly embellished and reclaimed by the mosque to create a new layer of religious meaning through Quranic calligraphy, wall hangings, and motifs. Without going into the details of the other fragments, but just to note them here, the Harrow Mosque entrance doors are replicated, which are the domestic entrances of the semi-detached houses, with new mosque signage installed. From Brick Lane Mosque, an upper floor dormer window to a room that is used as a children's classroom, showing how the panes of glass are used as display surfaces for Arabic letters, is reconstructed. And as the original building was of recognised historic import, an external pediment is recreated framing a sundial in which the date of the building is inscribed. And the women's prayer room, which is in the vault of the building, is also partly reproduced. Whilst the cast courts and V&A galleries house replicas of high art and architecture, conceived of as being of universal cultural value, the mosque fragments of the 2021 pavilion are more ordinary and unknown, except by those who use them. This is precisely the point. Migrant communities, their histories, their artefacts, the buildings they make, their tastes and aesthetics are ignored, unrecorded, and unrepresented by the institutions who act as the gatekeepers to cultural value and historic significance. These communities are, as Stuart Hall noted, heritageless. Although by reproducing these pieces for the Biennale, the museum is addressing this erasure and recognising the narrative of the mosque in Britain and its diasporic and migrant history, the objects are nonetheless exhibition pieces with no afterlife. For this work to have a meaningful impact, artefacts of British Islam would need to enter the permanent collection. Technology has always been central to the culture of reproduction of works of art and architecture. The 21st century brought new methods that would transform the field. The 3D digital scan, firing thousands of points across an object per second to precisely record its position in space and capture it as data and light, has blurred perceptions between the material and the virtual, and the value of the real versus the copy. Along with the physical mosque reproductions, the Biennale 2021 project will also involve the 3D digital scanning of the mosques being represented. The Mosque Scans, the first ever of this type of building, will enter the V&A collection as permanent digital artefacts. They will record examples of British mosques in a particular phase of their evolutionary journey, and thus capture an otherwise unrecorded stage of the history of Britain's religious architecture. The V&A Venice Biennale 2021 Pavilion invites engagement with the history of the mosque in Britain, and so a broader understanding and appreciation of Britain's Muslim history. Through the one-to-one replica and the digital scan, the exhibition allows the viewer to interact with the architecture of the mosque, both in an embodied way and in a physically detached, though information-rich way. The replica invites the viewer to experience that part of the mosque as it would be experienced by the user, and to understand something of being in the presence of the architecture, whilst the scan presents a complete building more accurately recorded, but dematerialised and virtual. The viewer can then compare the effects of each mode of representation and how they provide alternative, competing or composite understandings of sites, their significance, value and heritage.